So I'll hand back to Carrie now and welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Yeah, that was, I think that's really going to benefit a lot of people, and we're really starting to see more reviews, including non-randomised studies, either just non-randomised studies or a mixture of RCTs and non-RCTs as well. So hopefully this will help. And if anyone has got any experience with any of the tools, if anyone's undertaking a review at the moment, including non-randomised studies, we'd be very grateful for any thoughts people have. Please raise your hand or comment in the chat box if there's any questions. Okay, someone's raised their hand. Oh, Ella. Hi, Ella.
Hi. Hi. I thought that was really interesting. It was great to see the findings from that study. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about as you were going through the final slides is, within the report, do you have kind of an overview of the different tools and what study designs, non-randomized study designs, that they're most applicable to? Because I think that would be quite useful for potential authors.
Yes, the original commission was to consider a specific list of tools that were commonly used, and yet were not clearly already recommended. And part of the appendix of the report includes a map of the coverage of those different tools. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because most of the diversity of tools that are available, all the same, really only consider cohort and case control studies. So there's a lot of replication of the coverage of designs that are already well covered by Robin's Eye and Newcastle, Ottawa, and relatively few tools that address some of the designs that actually are perhaps more challenging to assess because of their complexity and perhaps their unfamiliarity, such as instrumental variable studies or regression discontinuity studies, for two examples.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I just wanted to mention as well that another project as part of these kind of public health methods projects is one on when to use non-randomized studies of interventions, and it tries to kind of go into the study design features that an author might need to consider dependent on their review question. So I think your project and that project are going to complement each other really well. That's still in, that's getting to the final stages of sign off, just for anyone else on the call that's interested.
That's great, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ella. We've got some comments coming through, Michelle, from Juan Franco. Thank you very much for the presentation. Question: some papers highlighted limitations in the reliability of Robin's Eye. How is this considered within the 16 criteria?
It's a good question. The wording that we went with for the criteria, for the 16 criteria that could be objectively assessed, was whether or not the validity and reliability had been evaluated in any way, i.e. it was a known factor of the tools, working on the assumption that it's better to know than for these properties never to have been assessed. Now, as you know, risk of bias is not something that can be quantified against a gold standard. It's not a diagnostic tool. So assessing validity and reliability of these tools is, already somewhat different from other, what we might call measurement tools. And also reliability will differ depending on the context of the evaluation. So I think we were right not to say, validity or reliability should meet a particular threshold for quality or for being recommended. Rather, the criteria simply said are these known properties of the tools, first of all, and then later in the user perceptions, people can record or offer their opinion as to whether or not they think the validity and reliability are good, are acceptable in some way. So in that way, the 22 criteria allow both of those elements, but without, while remaining agnostic about what good validity and reliability might be. I hope that answers your question, Juan.
Rachel Richardson, thanks Michelle, such a useful project. Linda Long, thank you for this great presentation. What would you recommend for assessing prevalence data studies? For example, observational studies of prevalence of microbial resistance.
So I hope I've been clear in showing that the choice of a tool will depend not only on its properties and documentation, but also on particular users' perceptions and needs. That said, I'd also add that in the comparison that we made, we focused on tools that assess study designs that had a comparative element, just in order to narrow our work a little bit. But of the groupings of tools that we looked at, which is only a small amount of the tools that are out there, I would say the only grouping of tools that would suit this particular use of prevalence studies would be the JBI group of tools. And that is the group of tools that I've used working with an ECDC group about the kind of fundamental epidemiology of COVID. So I hope that's helpful, but I've no doubt there are other tools out there that might be suitable for that particular purpose. And hopefully the results of this project would be helpful in evaluating and comparing the different tools available.
Montserrat, good morning, fantastic presentation. I was wondering, what are your thoughts about using these tools in non-randomized studies of exposures, which are not cohort studies?
So there is an entire additional, these were tools that are about non-randomized studies of interventions. There is, yet another set of hundreds of tools that are just about non-randomized studies of exposures. Lisa Barrow is part of a group who produced a very comprehensive comparison of those tools. And I can add a link to that, to the materials I'll put together for this presentation. More generally, what are my thoughts about using tools for study designs that they weren't, made to apply for? Then you're essentially creating a new tool based on an old tool. So an adaptation of a tool is yet another tool. And I think if one were to go about doing that, it might be an idea to start with tools that have already been designed for that particular purpose, because it will save work and be more efficient than adapting. And then the adaptation will have new unknown properties that might make it less suitable than the original for the new purpose. I hope that's helpful, but that's just my view.
We have someone with the hand up. Hector, would you like to?
Hi, Hector.
Yes, hi Michelle, how are you?
Good,
to see
how
you
are
again.
you?
Very well, very well. Well, I had the pleasure of working with Michelle many moons ago in the American Congress Center in Barcelona. Excellent presentation. I've taken lots of notes, and I do have a question. I took good note of your recommendation of when you take a new, a different tool, right? Make sure you enter in the limitations, whatever limitation this may have, right? And in the methods, explain why you're using this tool. So basically, I'm writing to support the question by Waldemar Siemens, which is the exact same question I have, and is that some of these tools are great, right? They graded well in the study, but they take so long. So we wonder if you have kind of like a tip of one or two tools that you think are feasible, that may have limitations, that may not have rated so well, but something that you could tell us, be like, well, there are these two tools that have limitations. Make sure you mention these limitations and use them if you have limited time and resources. Thank you.
Thanks, Hector. I agree completely that the time required to use some tools or to learn a new tool for a review group that is already, up and running and very efficient at using a tool that they've previously identified, that's a major driver for the diversity of tools that the editorial team must see coming in different reviews. And hopefully, it's sensible and helpful to just say, what are the strengths and limitations of these tools, and to, proceed in awareness of that. I'd also say that if the review is limited to cohort and case control studies, it's more difficult for me personally to see a need to use any of the tools that aren't already recommended, because Robin's Eye is so comprehensive. And if that is, too difficult or time consuming for a particular team, then Newcastle Ottawa is really not very time consuming or difficult to use. And that covers cohort and case control studies quite well. And once a team gets beyond those study designs, then it might be an issue of finding a tool that covers all of the designs that you want to include. In that case, the EPHPP tool is quite useful in being relatively broad in its questions, so allowing for the interrogation of different designs, including quasi-experiments and single cohort studies and case series, for example. But again, there are limitations of that as well. And that is a lack of very particular signaling questions that might help to understand some of the really core issues, particularly in natural experiments or quasi-experiments. So I think once you get beyond that field and you're dealing with a particular group of different study designs, it might take more effort to identify the best tool. But I would point people to the JBI suite of tools, which again are very efficient to use. I find them relatively easy to learn, and the documentation helps you understand quite well how to use them. And again, the variety of designs is quite wide in that grouping. But I really hate to make recommendations like that because there are so many tools, and no doubt there are many good ones, and people on this call might want to jump in and share their experiences, because there are probably excellent tools that could be recommended that I haven't used.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Hector. Good to see you.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks,
Likewise.
Hector. I think another point to make here is, if resources are limited, is to really prioritize what you're looking at within the review. So Robin's Eye is outcome based. So as with risk of bias too, we recommend that people assess the risk of bias for at least those outcomes included in the summary of findings table, because you need the risk of bias to inform grade, which then informs the risk of the ratings in the summary of findings table. So if you do find that you have limited resources, rather than perhaps choosing a more inferior tool, you could really think about what are the important outcomes for this review.
That's a great point, Carrie. And I would say one of the criteria that we considered was that the tool is outcome based, and I think that's a really important aspect of a tool to consider. And very few tools are outcome based. Of course, Robin's Eye is, and there are real advantages to approaching risk of bias assessment in that way. And not the least of those is, as you say, for the grade assessments. So it's well worth using Robin's Eye for the outcomes that will be in your grade tables. That's a great point.
Thanks. We've still got quite a few comments. It's reassuring to know from Gabrielle that the use of Newcastle Ottawa is okay, but how do others display the findings of these tools? I've tried to graph like for trials. Don't know whether you've got any experience, Michelle. I think RobViz, the tool that's available on riskofbias.info, is really good for displaying any tool. Really, you can input the domains that are included and whether it's for a particular outcome or the studies that are included. So I tend to use RobViz as much as possible. I don't know if others have other experience.
That's something you and I were discussing before this clinic, because it is a question that comes up quite often. And again, it's one of the criteria that was long listed, that the tool lends itself or is supported by some visualization method, but it wasn't identified as essential for choosing a risk of bias tool. And maybe that's because something like RobViz is so flexible in allowing you to input different criteria and still produce a nice traffic light graph.
There is, Michelle, I did actually find on the RevMan web knowledge base, there is documentation about how to edit risk of bias domains for other tools. So if you're using, I'll put the link into the chat, but if you're using risk of bias 2, if you enable risk of bias 2 in RevMan web, then you can't do this. But if you're using risk of bias 1, then you can edit the domains for the non-randomised studies tool. However, I'm not sure whether you'll be able to include both risk of bias 1 and the non-randomised studies, because it'll be thanks, Ella. Ella's just posted the RobViz link as well. So it's worth looking at that documentation for RevMan web. Another option is in RevMan as well is to create additional tables. So for Robin's Eye, it should be outcome based. So there should be one table for each outcome. I don't know whether if other people have got other experiences or other suggestions, please do contribute. We have a comment from Mia. As Kerry mentioned, it looks like a really useful thing you've undertaken. I'm currently completing a review with a mixture of RCTs, non-randomized studies, and also qualitative studies too. Something I'm definitely finding hard is identifying study designs of observational studies. I've chosen to use the JBI checklist matched to study designs, but I'm finding I'm answering not applicable for some of the items as the checklist doesn't seem to be a great fit for some.
Yeah, you're definitely not alone in that experience, Mia. I think everybody struggles with matching observational or non-randomized study designs to particular definitions and to particular checklists. And Carrie, as you said, there's another project that's looking at exactly that, or was it Ella? You mentioned another of the methods projects, maybe Jamie's.
Yeah, so it's that project is kind of getting to the final stages of completion, so we should be able to share a draft soon. But yeah, watch this space, I guess, for when that's available.
From Natalia, we've got, I wonder if Robin's Eye is a kind of gold standard. How can Cochrane help with making it more user-friendly, more training, more user-friendly manual? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Michelle. I know I've got some comments I can make.
That is something that you've been working on, isn't it, Carrie and Ella? Some more supportive guidance.
Yeah, one of the other projects was more reporting of Robin's Eye. In terms of training, I know the creators of Robin's Eye are actually updating the tool at the moment, which is why we haven't gone ahead with a webinar series like we did for Risk of Bias 2. But that is hopefully the plan for the future. Once they have updated Robin's Eye, then we will hopefully be able to organise a suite of webinars, including editorial considerations, you know, what to include in the protocol, and I'm sure the creators will have a training day as well, similar to they have done with Risk of Bias too. And then we can work with them. So for Risk of Bias 2, we've got frequently asked questions, and we held these web clinics which were more informal, and we had, you know, we probably had about 10 to 20 people who were chatting through queries for Risk of Bias 2. So again, we can do that with Robin's Eye once the update's available.
And Kerry, just to jump in here, what do you know what kind of areas they're looking at while they're updating Robin's Eye? What they're prioritising?
I don't know whether you know, Michelle. I'm not involved in the update, so
okay,
I'm not sure.
But I guess they'll be looking to address some of the, you know, some people have highlighted some that it can be, you know, time consuming, and maybe it's, you know, it takes a level of understanding, and maybe they're things that they're trying to address. It would be useful maybe to,
yeah, I think they might be simplifying some of the questions. Again, I can't say for certain. I think you know, non-randomised studies can be complex, and the assessment of risk of bias will be, no matter which tool you choose, or what they, you know, how they change Robin's Eye. So you know, you really have to have a justification for including non-randomised studies. So I think, you know, it's really important to really think about the review question that you're trying to answer at the beginning, really.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting
about these things later on.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see what's included then in that update. Do you know? You probably don't. I'm sorry for bombarding you and putting you on the spot. Do you know if they have a timeline for their project?
I know they're working on it, but I think it got delayed by COVID, so soon, I think. But I don't know a definite date.
Thank you.
Juan, this is in response to Juan's question before. Thank you for the response. I agree conceptually. I do wonder what's the value of adding reliability as a criteria if we do not think it's that important.
So I would say this is why I think it was good that in the methodology that we developed, along with the expert advisory group, that we kind of made a long list of all the criteria that could be relevant to assessing a risk of bias tool, and then put it kind of to Cochrane stakeholders to say, well, what do you think is important about this? And, you know, almost everyone rated that criterion as essential or desirable, and more than half rated it as essential. So that's kind of the rationale for including it. I also think that it is useful, at least, to be able to look at the literature and see that some assessment of the tools has taken place, so that their properties are known. And it relates to actually the next question about information about the feasibility of using the assessed tools. So if researchers conduct these studies investigating the validity and reliability, then we know more about the tools, and we learn more about how to implement them well, and that in itself is valuable. Relating to Valdemar's question about time required, obviously that will vary depending on the team and its expertise and its previous experience with the tools. There have been studies, particularly of Robin's Eye. I was involved in one of those studies, but there are others where we did measure the amount of time it takes to apply the tool properly, as you say. And it is, I think in our study, it was more than an hour to assess a single study with Robin's Eye, but that would change as we became more experienced and proficient in using it. And the same would be true of any review group. But, you know, it really does, I think, depend on how many studies are included in your review, because, you know, a review might have fewer than 5 studies, and it might be worth and very feasible to invest an hour per study, or the review might have, 80 or 100 included studies, and then there are resource implications, obviously. So most tools, I would say, can be applied faster than Robin's Eye in answer to your question, but also most tools are less comprehensive than Robin's Eye.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, so you definitely need that balance, which is, again, why I said about prioritizing outcomes and your review question as well, really. Sort of whether, you want to answer a more narrow question or a broader question. And we have a follow-up from Mia. Is it the case that risk-biased tools aren't expected to be perfect fit, but are instead expected to be more a suitable fit with sufficient justification of choice and outline the limitations of the application of these tools in that particular review?
Yeah, I would say I think that's right, particularly when we're dealing with observational and non-randomized studies and the kind of diversity of study designs and design elements in that field. It's often the case that we're having to take a kind of best fit approach in applying signaling questions to these studies. Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think it's worth noting that for RCTs, though, Cochrane has the original risk of bias tool or risk of bias 2 as the kind of the tools that are acceptable. Mm-hmm. So it's for, it gets more complicated with the non-randomized studies of interventions.
Exactly. And I mean, comparing with randomized trials, we have a well-established kind of culture of clear reporting and consistent design and trial registration, and then a kind of shared, collective knowledge about randomized trials and how they work. And as a community, as a research community, that is still forming in relation to non-randomized studies of interventions.
Thanks very much, Michelle. We've just got the links. Somebody asked for the link to the JBI tools, and thank you, Lucia, for providing that. Thank you for the RobViz detail. So I think, can you make are you going to make your slides available, Michelle, or
yes.
Because it's got the link to the GTI hub on as well, isn't it? So I don't know whether you want to type that in the chat if people are interested.
Just one moment, and I'll look that up.
Oh yeah, sure. Juan, do you want to speak or type or?
Yeah, you'll be quicker. Well, thanks again, and thanks again for the responses. I think that the presentation was great, and the responses were really good for helping us with this very thorny subject. My question was related to review questions related to policy. We're doing a protocol with some stakeholders, and when we discussed the risk of bias assessment, we said, well, we will use Robin's Eye because we can figure out the policy as an intervention. And we would look at the domains, and we discussed with the stakeholders. They had some, they thought that perhaps some of the studies that they anticipate they will encounter, because they were expert, they know the literature, they would not be a good fit for Robin's Eye, because most of these studies deal with aggregated data from countries, and they're analyzed in a different way. I'm not very familiar with the literature, but I do wonder whether you had experience with questions about policy, and whether we should think about the same way as, for example, non-randomized interventions of a drug.
Yeah. So this is a great question. I'm going to pop the link if I can find it. Just one moment in the chat. Some other Cochrane authors and myself wrote a paper about, particularly about using non-randomized studies of interventions in public health reviews, so mainly about policy questions. And I'm currently part of a group led by Thomas Heise and Stefan Lachimi, who are reviewing studies of the implementation of policies around sugar-sweetened beverage taxation, for example. And the study designs in these areas, how shall I say, are really quite distant from the cohort and case control designs that are widely used in epidemiology, and that are kind of the core of the Robin's Eye approach. And I would agree with you that the signaling questions at present for cohort studies really don't map terribly well to policy evaluation studies. The EPHPP tool that I mentioned is designed to take on board kind of quasi experiments or natural experiments that you might see, but it is quite challenging to, I think, for us as Cochrane reviewers with health backgrounds to take on these diverse study designs that appear in political science, in economics, and that are also kind of rapidly changing. One of the challenges I found in studying policy evaluations done by econometricians is that part of their approach is always to innovate with the methodology. So almost every study has some new study design element that you won't have seen anywhere else, because that's part of getting published in econometrics. So it really is quite challenging. I wouldn't think Robin's Eye would map very readily to a lot of those studies, but I do know that Julian's team is trying to develop signaling questions that will address a wider variety of study designs. And in the meantime, our approach in Cochrane Public Health in the sugar sweetened beverage taxation review has been to use EPOC for interrupted time series. It's very useful and very straightforward, and EPHPP for other designs.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Juan Michel. Jacqueline, would you like to speak?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Sorry, just a very quick question along similar lines. So there's a lot of things coming out from the COVID literature, and you see surveys of, and like you mentioned, different designs of surveys of health and health policy, and just to check that the tool you recommended will sort of help in that regard, because the CASP, I don't know if you know the CASP tool, that's sort of like the compromise, and I've been working with it in my head, before now, because they're just, most of them are surveys. Yes, there's some randomized component, embedded into the design or things like that, but like, you mentioned earlier, Robin's Eye will just completely, these studies will not even make it past the first few questions. So this is, so yeah, your thoughts around that will be appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So for cross-sectional studies, it's not something we specifically assessed in this project. We were only looking at comparative studies. I know that there is an adaptation of Newcastle Ottawa for cross-sectional surveys, so that is one option, but I don't believe it's authorized by the Newcastle Ottawa team. It just exists in the literature. JBI, I'm pretty sure, has a tool that covers this. But yeah, I mean, fundamentally, compared to other study designs, the cross-sectional survey has limitations in terms of identifying any kind of causal relationship. So these tools that take a broader approach, like Robin's Eye, as you say, a cross-sectional survey will rapidly kind of fall out of consideration.